Oyo was a powerful and prominent empire of the Yoruba people, present-day Western Nigeria. One of its military commanders who played a major role in its eventual collapse in 1835 was Afonja, the Aare Ona Kakanfo from Ilorin. Afonja's tenure as a military commander cannot be ignored when talking about the history of the Old Oyo Empire and, of course, the rest of Yorubaland up to Ilorin. Therefore, this video looks at the role Aare Ona Kakanfo Afonja played in the last days of the Oyo Empire. The Oyo Empire began around the 1300s in the savannah of West Africa, north of the tropical woods where other Yoruba people dwelt. Being in the savannah was advantageous because Oyo could employ horses, which it couldn't do further south due to tsetse-fly. The empire was able to extend its reach into sections of what is now northern and western Nigeria because of its armored cavalry. Interestingly, Oyo would also colonize the kingdoms of Alada and Dahomey, present-day Republic of Benin, allowing the empire to have direct access to European commodities. Not only that, but also the collection of tributes from its vassal states. During the 18th century, Oyo expanded as it became more involved in the slave trade. Between the Egba and the Ijebu to the south and the Hausa, Nupe and Ibariba to the north, the empire maintained its traditional role as brokers and dealers. From their work on Oyo royal plantations, enslaved laborers provided sustenance for the empire. Surplus labor was then sold to the Atlantic coast as it became available. Later in the 18th century, the empire became overly reliant on slave sales to Europeans, and when the trade declined and eventually ended, Oyo suffered. Some of its subjects began to rebel as the state's money and power dwindled. The Oyo Empire then fell to the superior armies of the Fulani of Ilorin in 1835. Of all the Yoruba kingdoms, the one that eventually acquired the largest territory and became a veritable empire was Oyo. It emerged as a strong kingdom in the middle of the 16th century from the Bariba and Tapa attacks, with an army composed of both cavalry and infantry. After a short period spent consolidating, it embarked on its imperial expansion around the beginning of the 17th century. The Alaafin who started this movement was Obalokun. He placed the first Ajele, that is political agents, at Egbado, an indication that Oyo's conquest had gone far down towards the coast. However, it was not towards the southwest alone that Oyo was expanding, but it also appeared to be expanding southeastwards, for an expedition by Obalokun is remembered to have been heavily defeated at the hands of the Ijesha. The bringing together of such a vast territory under a single administration was bound to have economic advantages, but the addition of such a vast area created a number of problems. The basic one was how to govern the territories, maintain peace and order, and at the same time prevent a breakaway. The administrative problems appeared to have been solved by the appointment of Ajele. Where the territory already had a ruler such as in Dahomey, the Ajele became a kind of colonial governor without whose consent the local ruler could not take any major political or economic decision, and through whom the annual tributes were sent to Oyo. Where the territory had no recognizable ruler before the Oyo conquest, the Ajele virtually became a sub-king. As long as Oyo's military might remained supreme, there were no threats of breakaways. The collapse of Old Oyo came from within. As a result of deep-seated political disputes, the authority of the Alaafin within the capital city had eroded to the point that he could no longer rule or command the allegiance and instinctive support of his chiefs. With the Alaafin and his chiefs so divided among themselves, the authority of Oyo as the capital city no longer carried weight in the rest of Oyo or the outskirts of the empire. All this happened before external factors became involved. Challenges to the authority of the Alaafin in the second half of the 18th century by leading civil and military chiefs were signs of this internal instability. At first, the decline of the Oyo Empire had started as early as 1750 with the dynastic intrigues and palace coup sponsored by Basharun Gaa, who was the leader of the Oyomesi Council. The Oyomesi were the 7 principal councillors of the state. It acted as a check and balance on the Alaafin's power, preventing the king from being an autocrat. The council forced many Alaafin to commit suicide during the 17th and 18th centuries. In his ambition for absolute control, Gaa enlisted the help of the Oyomesi and to a lesser extent the Ogboni to force 4 successive Alaafin to commit ritual suicide after receiving the symbolic parrot's eggs. The Basharun caused 2 Alaafin to commit suicide in 1750 alone. Because of this, Alaafin Labisi reigned for only 17 days, while Alaafin Awonbioju reigned for about 130 days before their rule ended prematurely due to Gaa's tyranny. It would be the same story for Alaafin Agboluaje Amaji Ogbe. Gaa's treachery was not ended until 1774, during the reign of Alaafin Abiodun, the 5th Alaafin he served. Basharun Gaa was subsequently executed by Abiodun, but the instability that had been brought forth by these intrigues had further weakened Oyo. Alaafin Abiodun during his reign had also conducted failed campaigns against Bogu in 1783 and Nukwe in 1789, losing the equivalent of 11 and 13 generals and their men respectively. Abiodun was then reportedly poisoned and killed by his own cousin, Aole, who then became the new Alaafin in 1789. Around the late 18th century, a formidable Oyo warrior named Afonja rose to prominence. His father's name was Alugmi, who in turn was the son of Pasin. Afonja's great-grandfather was Ladirin. It was he who founded Ilorin. Ladirin, Pasin, Alugmi, and Afonja were the only Yoruba kings to ever rule Ilorin. From 1754 until 1770, Alaafin Amaji Ogbe ruled the Oyo Empire and was succeeded by Alaafin Abiodun in the same year. Abiodun ruled for nearly 19 years until he was assassinated by his own cousin, Aole, in 1789. From 1789 until 1796, Aole ruled as Alaafin. During these years, Afonja was the Aare Ona Kakanfo and lived in Ilorin, a little village on the banks of the river Ahun, a tributary of the Niger River. Afonja was the 6th Aare Ona Kakanfo of the Oyo Empire. After his death, he was succeeded by Toyeje of Ogbomosho. After a conflict between Afonja and Alaafin Aole devolved into rebellion, his term as Aare Ona Kakanfo signaled the surrender of the Ilorin territory to the Sokoto Caliphate. This development has had a significant impact on the history of the Yoruba people north of Oyo to this day. The Revolt of Afonja was one of the events that led to the secession of Ilorin in 1793. Ilorin was a military camp headed by Afonja, the Aare Ona Kakanfo. When Aole ordered the Aare Ona Kakanfo to invade Alaafin Abiodun's maternal home, Iwerele, Afonja disobeyed and refused to cooperate because he was bound by an oath and didn't want to be subjected to a previous Alaafin's curse that any Aare Ona Kakanfo who assaulted Iwerele would die miserably. Another reason was offered in 1795 when Aole commanded Afonja to assault Akpomu, a market town in Ile-Ife. All the Alaafin of the Oyo Empire, due to the Yoruba belief that Ile-Ife was the spiritual home of the Yorubas, were previously made to swear an oath never to attack Ife. However, Afonja carried out Aole's order and sacked Akpomu. But on the return of the army from the campaign, the Aare Ona Kakanfo marched on the capital, Oyo-Ile, which was itself a taboo, and sent an empty-covered calabash to Aole. What this meant was that the Alaafin had been rejected and had to commit suicide. Eventually, Aole committed ritual suicide in 1796. He had ruled the Oyo Empire for 7 years. Afonja set about building up Ilorin where he was based as an independent town. In his rebellion, he received the support of other leading chiefs at Oyo who had their own grievances against the Alaafin. He also received the support of a few provincial rulers. As the initial efforts to suppress this rebellion failed, other chiefs followed his steps. Afonja also had the support of a few Muslims led by Alimi, a Fulani Muslim cleric who incited a revolt of the Hausa slaves on whom the care of horses and the strength of the cavalry force depended. With the aid of these few chiefs, Yoruba Muslims, the Fulani, and Hausa slaves, Afonja sustained his rebellion and proceeded to bring other parts of the kingdom under his control. Within a short while, however, Afonja fell out with his Fulani allies. He refused to become a Muslim. He complained about the excesses of the freed slaves and he tried to discipline them, only to discover that he was no longer in command. This followed the contest for the control of Ilorin. Aare Ona Kakanfo Afonja was eventually defeated and killed around the year 1824. The Yoruba Muslims led by Shola also failed in their bid to control the town. The Fulani emerged as the controllers of Ilorin, and the town became an outpost of the Sokoto Caliphate, a base for attempting the forcible incorporation of large parts of Yorubaland into the Muslim Empire, and, when that failed, a powerful center for the Islamization of the Yoruba people. Meanwhile, the Egba had taken advantage of the troubles to establish their independence, eventually moving to Abeokuta in 1830. Later, Dahomey also revolted and overthrew Oyo's imperial control. The empire was breaking up. The Fulani pressure on Oyo was such that the capital had to be evacuated and thousands of people fled from the center of the Oyo Empire to the southern parts of Oyo, the Osun and the Barapa areas, as well as the territories of Ijesha, Ekiti, Ile-Ife, and Abeokuta. After the death of Afonja, many attempts were made to recover Ilorin, but they all failed. The implosion of Oyo had started with the weakening of the Oyomesi after the death of Bashoronga. You can check out his full story in our next video.